The bread had burned again. Grace noticed it the way she noticed most things lately, quietly, without surprise, the way a person notices rain when they've already forgotten what dry feels like. She pulled the loaves from the stone oven with a folded cloth, set them on the cooling rack, and stood for a moment in the heat of her own kitchen, breathing in the smell of char and rosemary and the faint sweetness of the honey glaze she'd brushed on too early. Ruined. Again. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in a long time, and she wasn't entirely sure she still knew how. The hearthside wasn't much. She knew that. 3 tables inside, 2 more on the covered porch when the weather allowed, a hearth wide enough to roast a whole pig if anyone ever ordered one, which they didn't. The sign above the door was faded. The blue letters she'd painted herself 3 years ago now bleached by 2 hard winters into something almost unreadable. But the place was hers. Fully, legally, painfully hers. The only thing that still was. She had inherited it from her mother, who had inherited it from her mother. And before that, the building had been a tannery, which explained why the back wall still smelled faintly of something animal, no matter how many times Grace scrubbed it with lye soap. She didn't mind. She'd grown up in that smell. It meant home. It meant the only permanence she had left. Her husband, former husband, she corrected herself, though the word still caught in her throat like a fishbone, had tried to take it from her. That had been 18 months ago. The settlement had been brief and ugly, and conducted in a cold room before a council elder who clearly found the entire matter beneath him. Edmund had stood across the table from her in his good wool coat, the one she had saved for 2 seasons to buy him, and told the council that she was unstable, that she ran the restaurant into debt, that she had never been a proper mate for a man of his standing. She had not, at that point, known that Edmund had been sleeping with the daughter of a border clan elder for the better part of a year. She had not known that the debt he cited was money he had borrowed against the building without her knowledge. She had not known a great many things about the man she had believed, with her whole and foolish heart, that she loved. The council had ruled in her favor. The hearthside stayed hers. Edmund had walked out without looking at her, and she had stood on the street afterward in the cold, with her coat unbuttoned, and thought, so this is what the bottom feels like. She'd assumed then that things would eventually improve. They had not improved. They had simply continued. The boy appeared on a Thursday evening, near the end of service, when the last of her regulars had already gone home, and Grace was scraping the grill and wondering whether the turnip soup she'd made was worth saving, or whether she should feed it to the stray cat that lived behind the woodpile. She heard the door first, the creak of the old hinge she kept meaning to oil. And then she heard nothing, which made her look up. He was standing just inside the doorway, not moving, with the specific stillness of someone who has learned to make himself small. He looked about 14, maybe 15. Thin in a way that had nothing to do with being a boy. Thin in the way of someone who hadn't eaten properly in days, whose body had started making calculations. His coat was too big, clearly not his, and beneath it he wore a linen shirt that had once been white and was now the color of old snow. His dark hair was matted at one temple. There was a cut on his jaw, dried and not deep, but there. His eyes, when they found her, were very careful. Not frightened exactly. Watchful. Like something that had been frightened so many times it had moved past fear into a kind of permanent readiness. Grace set down the scraper. "We're closed," she said. And then, before he could move, "But I have soup." She didn't know why she said it. She had said it before to others. To the widow from the East Quarter who sometimes came in on cold nights. To the miller's apprentice who'd broken his wrist and couldn't work. The hearthside was small and barely kept her fed. But Grace had never once turned away someone who looked like they needed a bowl of something hot. Her mother had called it poor business. Her grandmother had called it the only kind of business worth doing. The boy blinked. Something in his expression shifted. Very slightly. Not relief exactly, but the ghost of it. "Sit," she said, nodding toward the table nearest the fire. He sat. He didn't take off the coat. She brought him the soup, the turnip, which was actually quite good, she realized as she ladled it, with the herbs she'd added at the last moment, and a good crack of pepper. She brought bread too, the pieces that hadn't burned, with butter and a small crock of the apple preserve she'd made in autumn. She set it all in front of him, and went back to the grill without saying anything, because she understood instinctively that being watched while eating is its own kind of humiliation. He ate slowly at first, then faster. Then he stopped himself, very deliberately, and slowed again. The self-control in that was remarkable, and it made her chest ache. When she came back with a second portion before he'd asked, he looked up at her with those careful eyes. "I don't have coin," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, with a roughness that suggested it had only recently changed. "I can work. I can carry wood or wash." "I didn't ask," Grace said. She sat across from him with her own bowl. She'd been meaning to eat for hours, and they shared the table in silence for a while. The fire crackled. Outside, rain had started, a light, persistent autumn rain that made the street sound like whispering. The boy ate everything she'd brought him. He ate with the focused gratitude of someone who understood that food was not guaranteed, and that understanding, Grace thought, was both very young and very old at once. "What's your name?" she asked when his bowl was empty. He hesitated, a pause that was just a breath too long. "Kale," he said. She nodded. She didn't press. She'd noticed the hesitation, but she'd also noticed the cut on his jaw, and the way he held his left arm slightly apart from his body as though it was sore, and the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of more than one sleepless night. Whatever his full name was, and whoever he was running from, it wasn't her business unless he chose to make it so. "I'm Grace," she said. "You can sleep in the back room tonight if you need. There's a cot. It's not comfortable, but it's dry." Kale looked at her. Really looked, the way people rarely did, with a kind of unguarded attention that reminded her, absurdly, of the way her old dog used to look at her when she was sad, as though he could see straight through whatever face she was wearing. "Why?" he asked. The question wasn't rude. It was genuine. He genuinely wanted to know. Grace thought about it for a moment. "Because it's raining," she said finally, "and because no one should sleep outside in the rain when there's a dry room available. Those are all my reasons." He was quiet for another moment. Then, very quietly, "Thank you." She waved a hand and started clearing the table. He stayed 3 days. On the first morning, she woke to find the woodpile stacked higher than she'd left it, the split logs arranged with a precision that suggested someone who found order calming. The front step had been swept. The broken shutter latch she'd been ignoring for a month had been reset with a piece of wire twisted in a way she wouldn't have thought of herself. She didn't mention any of it. He helped in the kitchen without being asked, learning where things were with an almost unnerving speed, and he worked without complaint, and without the particular kind of performance she'd sometimes seen in people who wanted to be seen helping. He just helped. He had an instinct for when she needed quiet, and when a question was welcome. He never touched anything that wasn't offered. He slept on the cot in the back, and each morning left it made up with a neatness that was almost formal, the blanket folded with corners that were very nearly perfect. On the second evening, when the restaurant was quiet and they were both tired, she caught him looking at the faded photograph above the bar. Her mother and grandmother, standing in front of the hearthside in its better years, both squinting against the sun. "Is that your family?" he asked. "What's left of it?" she said. He nodded slowly. He had the expression of someone who understood the specific weight of that sentence. On the third morning, she came downstairs to find 2 men in the street outside the window. They were not from the village, She knew everyone in the village, and she knew that she did not know these two. They were large, in the particular way of trained fighters, wide through the shoulders, deliberate in how they stood, wearing traveling coats over what looked like uniforms beneath. They weren't looking at the hearthside directly. They were looking at the street, at the whole street, scanning it, searching. Grace went to the back room. Cale was awake. He was already awake, sitting on the edge of the cot, fully dressed, and the look on his face told her he already knew. "They're looking for you," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." He didn't look away. "I'm sorry. I didn't think they'd track me this far south." He stood. "I'll go out the back. You won't be involved." "Who are they?" A pause. That same pause as when she'd asked his name. "My father's men," he said. Grace looked at him for a long moment. The cut on his jaw, the careful eyes, the self-control of a boy who had learned, somewhere along the way, that showing need was dangerous. "Your father sent soldiers to find you?" she said slowly. "Guards," Cale corrected. And then, as if deciding something, "My father he has a large territory. He takes disappearances seriously." There was something in the word territory that landed differently than it should have. And something in the way he said disappearances, clinical, careful, like a word chosen to replace another word he wasn't ready to use. Grace looked out through the small window at the two men in the street, still scanning, still searching with the systematic patience of people who were very good at finding things. She looked back at Cale. She thought of all the reasons this was not her problem. All the reasons a woman alone running a failing restaurant on the edge of a village she barely belonged to anymore should not involve herself in whatever trouble a boy with a false name had brought to her door. She thought of the woodpile, the swept step, the blanket folded with perfect corners. "Is your father a man worth being afraid of?" she asked. Cale met her eyes. "Everyone is afraid of my father," he said. And there was no pride in it, just fact. Grace exhaled through her nose, looked once more at the street. "Then we'd better be quick," she said. "The cellar has a door that opens onto the alley. Go. I'll keep them busy." Cale stared at her. "Grace, go," she said, firm, final, the way her grandmother used to say it. He went. She wiped her hands on her apron, straightened her back, and walked out to the front of the hearthside to greet the men at her door. She didn't know then what she had just done. She didn't know whose son she had fed, sheltered, and helped escape. She didn't know that the word territory had been the smallest possible description of what Cale's father controlled. She didn't know that by nightfall, those two guards would return, not with anger, but with a message, and that the message would not be what she expected. She didn't know that the most feared Alpha King in the known territories had just learned that a woman named Grace had fed his missing son bread and turnip soup and given him a dry place to sleep, and asked for nothing in return. She didn't know any of it yet. She just walked out to meet the guards, with flour still on her hands and her heart beating harder than she wanted to admit. And she smiled the way her mother had taught her to smile when something was frightening, and there was nothing to do but face it anyway. The guards were polite. That was the first thing that surprised her. Grace had prepared herself for coldness, for interrogation, for the particular brand of intimidation that men in uniforms tend to carry like a second weapon. She had rehearsed, in the 30 seconds it took her to walk from the back room to the front door, a version of herself that was calm and ordinary and had absolutely nothing to hide. She had her apron on. She had flour on her hands. She was, to all appearances, simply a woman who ran a small restaurant and had been interrupted in the middle of her morning bread. The taller of the two men inclined his head when she opened the door. A slight bow. Not deep, but real. "Forgive the hour, madam," he said. His voice was controlled, precise. "We're looking for a young man. dark hair, approximately this height. He indicated with his hand. He may have come through this part of the village in the last few days. Grace tilted her head in the way of someone trying to be helpful, and not quite succeeding. A great many people come through here, she said. I run a restaurant. Could you describe him further? The second guard, shorter, broader, with a scar along his chin, watched her with eyes that were doing considerably more work than his face suggested. She felt the weight of that attention, and kept her expression open, pleasant, faintly puzzled. He would have been alone, the tall one continued. Possibly tired. A pause, almost too brief to notice. He left home without telling anyone. His father is concerned. His father is concerned. The words were so careful they were almost architectural, built to hold weight without showing the structure beneath. I'm sorry, Grace said. I haven't seen anyone matching that description. She paused. If I do, is there somewhere I should send word? The tall guard reached into his coat and produced a small folded card, sealed with dark wax. He held it out. She took it. That will reach the right people, he said. She nodded, smiled, held the door in a way that was not quite closing it, but was unmistakably a conclusion. The guards left. She watched them go, watched them move down the street with that same systematic patience, checking doorways, pausing at corners. And she didn't move until they turned out of sight. Then she closed the door, leaned her back against it, and let out a breath that felt like it had been stored for several minutes. She looked down at the card in her hand. The seal was pressed deep into the wax, a wolf's head in profile, clean-lined and severe, with a crown of mountain peaks above it. She had seen that seal before. Everyone had. It appeared on trade agreements and border declarations, and the occasional royal decree that filtered down even to villages as small as hers. She had seen it on documents but never held it, never had cause to. Her hands, she noticed, were very steady. She found that faintly interesting. She slipped the card into her apron pocket and went back to her bread. Cale returned that evening. She hadn't expected him to. She'd assumed, hoped in a complicated way, that he'd used the alley to get clear of the village entirely, that he was already south of the river road, and moving toward wherever a boy with a false name and his father's guards on his trail was trying to go. She had made her peace with not knowing the end of his story. She was good at that, making peace with incomplete things. But there he was, just after the supper service, sitting on the back step, with his coat pulled close and a look on his face that she was beginning to recognize as his version of shame. She handed him a bowl of stew without saying anything, sat beside him on the step. They listened to the night for a while, an owl somewhere in the trees behind the alley, the distant sound of the mill pond. They'll come back, he said finally. I know. Grace. He stopped, started again. I should tell you who I am. You should, she agreed. She didn't push. He was quiet for a long moment. She watched the side of his face, the jaw that was healing now, the shadows beneath his eyes that had lightened slightly after 2 nights of real sleep. He looked, she thought, like someone who was very tired of carrying something alone. My name is Cale Draven, he said. She kept her face neutral. The name landed like a stone into still water, sending out rings she could feel even before she fully understood why. Draven. The name that appeared above the seal. The name on the trade agreements and the border declarations. The name that, in certain parts of the territory, people said quietly, and then looked around to see who had heard. And your father, she said carefully, is Valen Draven. Cale looked at his hands. Alpha King of the Northern and Eastern Territories, Lord of the Draven Pack. A pause that was almost wry. He has more titles. I've never been able to remember all of them. Grace sat with that for a moment. The owl called again. Somewhere a horse shifted in its stable. "Why did you run?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately, and she respected that. She waited. "Because they were going to send me back to the High Court," he said at last. "To my uncle's household. For training, they call it. My father's brother." Something crossed his face, swift and dark, gone before she could fully read it. "I've been there before. I don't want to go back." The way he said training had the same careful architecture as the guards concerned, words built to hold something heavier than they appeared. She didn't ask what the training involved. She looked at the cut on his jaw and the way he held his left arm, and she thought she had a reasonable shape of it already. "And your father?" she said. "Does he know what happens there?" The pause this time was the longest yet. "I don't know," Cale said. And the honesty in it, the genuine uncertainty, was somehow worse than a simple yes or no would have been. He looked up at her. He's not a cruel man. I don't think he is. But he's very far away. And my uncle is very close. And some things are easier not to know." Grace thought of Edmund. Of the debt he'd borrowed against her building without telling her. Of how easy it had been, she'd realized afterward, for a person to not know things they found inconvenient to know. "You should tell him," she said. "Your father." Cale looked at her with those careful eyes. "He wouldn't believe me over my uncle," he said. "Aldrich is his brother, his advisor, his—" He shook his head. "I'm just the boy who ran away." "You're his son," Grace said. She said it simply, without sentiment, as a fact, as a thing that should matter and perhaps, she thought, had not been said to him plainly enough or often enough, and that absence had its own kind of damage. Cale was quiet for a long time after that. She let him stay. She told herself it was practical, that throwing him out at night in a village where his father's guards were still asking questions would do him no good and would bring attention to her door regardless. She told herself she would sort it out in the morning. She told herself a great many things that were partially true and entirely insufficient. The real reason was simpler and harder to say. She recognized him. Not his face or his name. She recognized the shape of what he was carrying. She knew what it felt like to be somewhere you were supposed to belong and feel the ground moving beneath you. She knew what it felt like when the people who should have protected you had found it more convenient not to know. She could not fix that for him. She was a woman with a small restaurant, and fading sign and bread that burned at the edges. She had no power in the world that Cale Draven came from, but she could give him another night. And morning came with its own possibilities. The knock came at dawn. Not the guards this time. She knew, even before she opened the door, that it was something different. The knock itself was different. Not a guard's formal rap, but something heavier, slower, with a patience in it that was almost more unsettling than urgency would have been. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders and opened the door. The man on her threshold was tall, taller than the guards, and broader. But what struck her first was not his size. It was the stillness. He stood in her doorway in the early gray light with the absolute physical composure of someone who had never in his life needed to fill a room with noise or movement, because the room simply rearranged itself around him without being asked. He wore a dark traveling coat, plain, expensive in the way of things that are well made rather than ornamented. No insignia, no crown, obviously. But the seal on the card in her pocket might as well have been pressed into the air around him. His eyes found hers immediately. Dark, pale-ringed, the color of deep water over gray stone. They were not unkind. They were not warm either. They were the eyes of someone who missed very little and had learned to trust that quality in himself. "Grace Calloway," he said. Her name, in his voice, was not a question. She realized she had known, from the moment the knock sounded, that this was coming, that the guards had been preliminary, that a man like Vaylin Draven, when his son went missing, did not stay at home and wait for reports. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an attention that was almost clinical in its precision, taking in her shawl, her bare feet on the cold threshold, the flour that was already somehow back on her hands from the early baking she'd started before dawn. "My son is here," he said. Still not a question. Grace held the door and held his gaze and thought, in the space of a single breath, about what kind of woman she wanted to be in the next 30 seconds. "He's asleep," she said. "Would you like to come in? I have coffee. Real coffee. A merchant came through last week." Something shifted in Vaylin Draven's expression. Infinitesimal. A thing that might, in a lesser man, have been surprise. He stepped inside. She closed the door behind him and went to put the kettle on, because her hands needed something to do and because she had found most things, even things that were enormous and frightening and entirely outside the scope of a woman who ran a small restaurant on the edge of a village, were marginally more manageable when there was something warm to hold. She could feel him behind her, standing in her kitchen, in the heat of her hearth, in the smell of her bread. She did not turn around. She filled the kettle and set it over the fire and breathed slowly. She didn't know what he would do when Cale woke. She didn't know what kind of father he was in rooms with no guards present. She didn't know whether the stillness he carried was the stillness of a man in control of himself, or the stillness of something that hadn't decided yet whether to be dangerous. But she had invited him in, and the bread was almost ready. And Grace Calloway had never, in her entire life, let a guest sit at her table without something warm to eat. The coffee was good. She knew it was good because she watched him take the first sip without any of the ceremony of politeness, without the small performative pause that people use when they want to seem appreciative. He simply drank, and something in his shoulders, already still, became a different kind of still, the kind that comes from something unexpected and genuine. Grace sat across from him with her own cup and said nothing. She had learned, in 3 years of running a restaurant alone, that silence was not always an absence of something. Sometimes it was the most honest thing available. Vaylin Draven looked around her kitchen the way he'd looked at her on the threshold, with that precise, comprehensive attention that took in everything without appearing to linger on anything. The wide hearth, the copper pots hung by size, the bundles of dried herbs along the ceiling beam, the crack in the plaster above the window that she'd been meaning to fill since spring. The photograph above the bar, visible through the open doorway. The faded sign, readable from inside in reverse. "You've run this place alone," he said. Not a question, an observation. 18 months, she said. Before that, my husband. She wrapped both hands around her cup. Former husband. He nodded once, slowly, as though this piece of information was being placed somewhere precise and orderly inside his mind. "Cale said you fed him," Vaylin said, "and gave him a room." "He was hungry," Grace said, "and it was raining." "You didn't ask who he was." "He told me his name was Cale. That seemed sufficient." Something crossed the Alpha King's face, not quite a smile, not one. A compression at the corners of his mouth, controlled before it could become anything readable. "He told my guards he'd given you a false name," Vaylin said. "He gave me a first name," Grace said. "That's not the same thing as a false one." This time the compression held a beat longer before it settled. They sat in silence again. The kettle ticked as it cooled. From the back room came no sound at all. Cale, she suspected, was awake, and had been awake since the knock, and was currently performing the particular stillness of someone hoping very hard not to be noticed. She understood the impulse. She also understood that it wasn't going to serve him this morning. "He doesn't want to go to your brother's household," she said. The stillness that came over Valen then was different from all the stillness that had come before it. It was not calm. It was the surface over something that moved. "He told you that," Valen said. "He did." A pause. "What else did he tell you?" Grace looked at him directly. She had been raised by women who believed that the eyes were the part of a person that couldn't be fully controlled. And she had spent enough years across tables from enough different people to know that Valen Draven, whatever else he was not a man accustomed to being looked at squarely by someone who had no reason to fear him and wasn't pretending otherwise. "He told me he'd been there before," she said, "and that he didn't want to go back. He didn't tell me what happened there. He didn't need to." She paused. The cut on his jaw was 3 days old when he arrived. His left arm gave him trouble for the first 2 days. He's 14 or 15, and he's learned to eat slowly, even when he's starving. Which means someone taught him that desperation was something to be ashamed of. She set her cup down. "Those things together tell a story, my lord. And it's not a story about a boy who ran away from a loving household because he was being difficult." The silence after that was very long. Valen's hands around his cup were absolutely motionless. His face had not changed in any way that she could have pointed to specifically, and yet everything about it was different. He was looking at her as though she had said something in a language he hadn't expected to hear spoken in a kitchen this size, in a village this small, by a woman with flour on her hands and bare feet on cold flagstones. "You're not afraid of me," he said. It came out almost wondering. "I'm a little afraid of you," Grace said honestly. "But I was afraid of my husband too at the end, and I still said what needed saying then. I found that being afraid of someone is not a reliable reason to be quiet." Valen looked at her for another long moment. Then he said quietly, and with a weight that suggested it cost him something, "Tell me what you observed. Everything." She told him. Not everything. She kept back the things that were Cale's to tell if he chose to, the specific words, the particular pauses. But she told him what she had seen in the boy's body, in his habits, in the way he worked and moved and held himself. She told it plainly, without drama, the way she might describe an ingredient or a weather pattern. She was not performing emotion, and she was not asking for anything. She was simply reporting what was true, because it was true, and because someone with the power to act on it was sitting at her table. Valen listened. He did not interrupt once. He did not look away. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he stood, slowly, and walked to the doorway that led to the back corridor. He stopped there. "Cale," he said. A long pause. Then, from the back room, the sound of a door. Slow footsteps. Cale appeared in the corridor looking exactly as Grace had imagined. Fully dressed, guarded, braced for something. He looked at his father the way someone looks at a drop they're not sure they can survive. Valen looked at his son for a long moment. His face was unreadable in the way of a man fighting very hard to keep it so. "Come here," he said. Cale crossed the corridor and stopped an arm's length away. The wariness in him was a physical thing, visible in every line of his posture. Valen reached out and put one hand on the back of his son's neck. Not roughly, not pulling, just resting there. A grip that was also a steadiness. He looked at the jaw, the arm. His expression, for just a moment, fractured along some internal line before it sealed again. "You should have come to me," Valen said. Low, rough at the edges. "I didn't think you'd—" Cale began. "I know," Valen said. "That's my failure, not yours." Grace looked away. She looked at her cup, at the grain of the table, at the rain beginning again outside the window. Some things were not meant to be witnessed by strangers. and she had the sense that what was happening in her corridor was one of them. They stayed another 2 hours. Valen's remaining guards, 4 more she discovered, who had been waiting at the end of the street, were sent away with instructions she didn't fully hear. Cale ate breakfast at her table, the good bread with butter and the last of the apple preserve, and slowly the braced look left his shoulders, and he started to look, again, like simply a tired boy who had eaten well twice in a row. Valen ate little, and said little, and watched everything. At one point, when Cale had gone to the back room to collect the few things he'd left there, Grace was alone in the kitchen with the Alpha King, washing the bowls at the basin, and she became aware that he had moved to stand beside the bar, looking at the photograph. "Your mother?" he asked. "And her mother," Grace said. 3 generations in this building. You intend to keep it." "I've kept it through worse than the current situation," she said, which admittedly is saying something. "The debt," he said. "Your former husband borrowed against the property." She went still for just a moment, her hands in the basin. Then she continued washing. "I've cleared most of it," she said, in a tone designed to close the subject. Valen was quiet for a moment. "The remainder," he said. "Consider it settled." Grace turned around. He was not looking at her with charity. He was not looking at her with pity. He was looking at her with the same direct, precise attention he'd used for everything else, as though this was simply a matter being correctly ordered, an account brought into balance, a thing that was owed. "I didn't feed your son expecting payment," she said. "I know," Valen said. "That's precisely why it's being paid." She held his gaze. He held hers. The morning light was coming through the high window now, cutting across the kitchen floor in a long pale stripe, and standing in it, he looked less like something carved from stone, and more like something that had been standing in wind for a very long time, and had learned to be unmoved by it without becoming unfeeling. "My lord," she said carefully, with respect. "Valen," he said. She blinked. "My name," he said. "You can use it. You've spoken more plainly to me this morning than most people manage in a year. Titles seem unnecessary at this point." Grace looked at him for a moment. Then, despite everything, despite the strangeness of the morning, despite the guards in the street and the royal seal and the magnitude of what she'd stumbled into by opening her door to a hungry boy in the rain, she felt something lighten, very slightly, in her chest. Not safety, not trust. Something smaller and more cautious than either of those. "The debt is mine to settle," she said, "but I'll accept the gesture and the spirit it's offered." Something moved in his expression. That not quite smile again. There and gone. Cale reappeared with his bundled coat, and the moment dissolved back into the ordinary, or whatever ordinary meant now, in a morning that had begun with an Alpha King at her door, and was apparently ending with him settling her accounts and drinking her coffee. Valen moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. "The man your husband borrowed from," he said, without turning. "He's been charging interest above the legal rate for this district." Grace went still. "I know," she said. "He won't continue to do so," Valen said. Then he walked out into the morning, Cale at his side, and Grace stood in her kitchen doorway watching them go, the boy she'd fed, and the king she hadn't known she was feeding, moving together down the pale, wet street, and felt the specific vertigo of a world that had shifted several degrees off its previous axis without asking her permission. She went back inside. She had bread to finish, and a crack in the plaster to fill, and apparently, a debt that was being settled by someone she had met 3 hours ago, which was either the strangest thing that had ever happened to her, or only the beginning of strange things, and she wasn't yet sure which. She put the kettle back on. She breathed. She waited to see what the day would do next. 3 weeks passed. Grace told herself, during those 3 weeks, that the morning with Valen Drayvon had been an anomaly. a strange fold in the fabric of her ordinary life that would smooth itself back out with enough time and enough bread to bake and enough tables to wipe down. She told herself this with the same quiet discipline she applied to most things, and for the first week, it almost worked. Then the debt collector stopped coming. Not gradually, not with explanation, simply stopped. The man who had appeared at her door every fortnight for 18 months, with his leather ledger and his above-rate interest calculations, and his particular smile that managed to be both apologetic and threatening simultaneously, simply did not appear. She waited for him the first week with her shoulders already tightened in anticipation. The second week, she waited with something more like puzzlement. By the third week, she had accepted, without fully accepting, that he was not going to come again. She didn't ask why. She already knew why. What she didn't know was why that knowledge sat in her chest with such complicated weight. Not quite gratitude, not quite resentment. Something in the uneasy territory between them. She had not asked for help. She had not performed her difficulty for anyone's benefit. She had simply fed a boy in the rain and told his father the truth, and now a problem that had been grinding her down for a year and a half had quietly, completely disappeared. It should have felt like relief. It did feel like relief. It also felt like something she hadn't earned, which was irrational, because she had earned it in every way that mattered. She had kept the building. She had cleared most of the debt herself through 18 months of brutal economy. She had not asked anyone for anything. And yet, she was still thinking about it on the morning the letter arrived. It came with a messenger she didn't recognize. A young man in a plain gray coat, no insignia, who handed her a sealed envelope with a small bow and departed before she could ask him anything. She stood in her doorway holding it. The seal was the same dark wax, the same wolf's head in profile. But the handwriting on the front, Grace Calloway, the Hearthside, was not the formal script of an official communication. It was direct and slightly compressed and moved across the paper as though the writer's hand thought faster than it wrote. She opened it at the kitchen table with her morning coffee. Miss Calloway, Cale asked me to tell you that the apple preserve was the best he's had, and that he intends to tell you so himself when the opportunity presents itself. I've given him permission to write to you directly, which he will do at considerable length, as he has apparently decided that you are one of approximately 3 people in his current world worth talking to. I am choosing to take this as an indication of your character rather than a criticism of his circumstances. I am writing separately because there is a matter I believe you should be informed of. Aldrich Drevon, my brother and former senior advisor, is no longer in his position. The details are being handled through the appropriate council channels and are not your concern except insofar as they relate to what you told me in your kitchen. What you observed and reported was accurate. It was also information that several people with considerably more access to my household had and chose not to bring to me. I find that worth noting. The Hearthside's remaining debt has been cleared in full. I am aware you did not ask for this. I am also aware that the rate you were being charged was illegal, which makes the correction a matter of law rather than charity. You are not obligated to feel indebted. If there is anything you need, a name attached to mine opens doors in this territory that would otherwise remain closed. You have earned the right to use it. V. Drevon Grace read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully, with the precise corners she had learned from watching Cale make his cot, and placed it in the drawer beneath the bar, where she kept things she wanted to keep. She stood for a moment with her hand on the drawer. Aldrich Drevon is no longer in his position. She thought of Cale's face when he'd said the word training. She thought of the cut on his jaw. She thought of how Valen had stood in her corridor with his hand on the back of his son's neck, and how his face had fractured along some internal line before sealing again. And she understood that the letter was, among other things, a man telling her, in the most compressed and controlled way available to him, that he had believed her, and acted, and that it had mattered. She closed the drawer. She went back to her bread. Cale's letter arrived 4 days later and was, as promised, considerable in length. It covered the apple preserve in genuine detail, a description of his rooms at the main Draven estate which he rendered with the careful objectivity of someone trying very hard not to seem impressed by their own circumstances. 3 questions about how she made the turnip soup, a brief and understated account of the council proceedings against his uncle that told her more in what it didn't say than in what it did, and, at the end, a single paragraph that she read 3 times. My father asked about you twice this week. Not directly, which is how he asks about most things he actually cares about. He asked Marin, she's his head of household staff, whether the restaurant district in the southern villages had been affected by the early frost. And then he asked whether she thought the road conditions would make trade difficult for smaller establishments. Marin told me afterward because she finds him entertaining when he thinks he's being subtle. She also said, and I am reporting this accurately, that she has not seen him write a personal letter in 4 years. I am not drawing any conclusions. I am simply reporting the facts. Grace folded that letter and put it in the same drawer. She stood with her hand on the drawer again for slightly longer this time. The invitation came 6 weeks after the morning at her door. It was formal, properly sealed, properly scripted, the kind of document that arrived rolled and ribboned rather than simply folded. An invitation to the winter gathering at Draven Hall, a seasonal assembly of pack leaders, council members, and allies of the Northern and Eastern territories. A gathering, the document noted, at which the Alpha King would be making several formal announcements regarding recent changes to his advisory council. At the bottom, below the formal text, in that same compressed handwriting, Kale wants you there. So do I, if you're willing. The road from the southern villages is clear until the 2nd week of the frost month. The choice is entirely yours. V. Grace set the invitation on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. She thought about what she was, a woman with a small restaurant and a faded sign and bread that burned at the edges. A woman who had been left and lied to and had rebuilt herself from the pieces with no help from anyone. Slowly, imperfectly, but completely enough to still be standing. She thought about the world Vaylin Draven moved in. The council chambers and the formal assemblies and the weight of a name that made people look around when they said it. And she thought about what she would be in that world. Not nothing. But not comfortable either. She thought about Kale's letter. I am not drawing any conclusions. She thought about the compressed handwriting at the bottom of the invitation, and what it cost a man like that to write "so do I," when he could have left it at the formal text and let the invitation speak for itself. She looked out the window at the street. The frost had come early this year, just as his letter had mentioned. A light frost, not yet hard, that silvered the cobblestones each morning and melted by noon. The village was quiet in the way of places settling into winter. The 2 tables on the covered porch had been brought inside. The sign above her door caught the pale morning light, the faded letters just barely readable. The hearthside. 3 generations in this building. Her mother's hands, and her grandmother's hands, and now hers, in the bread and the copper pots, and the crack in the plaster she had finally, 2 weeks ago, filled with fresh lime putty. She had built a life in this kitchen. A small life, a hard life, but hers. Completely, unmistakably hers in a way that nothing else had been. She could stay. The debt was gone. The restaurant was steady, steadier than it had been in years, she realized. Because whatever Vaylin had said to the man who'd been overcharging her had apparently also clarified something about the general business climate of the district. And 2 other merchants who had been quietly squeezing small establishments had also, in the past month, become considerably less aggressive. She had more customers. She was sleeping better. She could stay, and the staying would be good. She looked at the invitation. She thought of what it felt like to be seen, not assessed, not evaluated for usefulness or adequacy, or whether she measured up to some expectation. Seen. The way he had listened in her kitchen with absolute attention and no agenda. The way the letter had said you are not obligated to feel indebted, not as a manipulation, but as a genuine release. The way Cale had written he has not sent a personal letter in 4 years, and then very carefully claimed to be drawing no conclusions. She got up and found her pen. She wrote back. Formally, because the invitation was formal. And then, below the formal acceptance, in her own plain handwriting. Tell Cale the soup is 3 parts turnip, 1 part parsnip, and the pepper must go in at the very end, or it turns bitter. And tell him I'm glad he's somewhere safe. G. She sealed it. She sent it with the morning's outgoing post before she could reconsider. Then she went to find her good wool dress, the dark green one she'd worn only twice. Once to the council hearing, once to her mother's grave, and she hung it near the window to air out. Because the gathering was in 11 days, and she had bread to bake and tables to run and a restaurant to hand to her neighbor's daughter for the week. And she had apparently decided. She was not sure what she was deciding toward. She was not sure what a woman like her did in the world of Draven Hall, or what Valen Draven was to her, or what she might become in proximity to a man who listened like that, and wrote letters like that, and had quietly, methodically dismantled the thing that had been crushing her, without once asking her to be grateful. She didn't know any of it yet. But she had spent 18 months being afraid of the wrong things, and she was done with that particular habit. She went back to her bread. She let the dress air. She did not let herself think too carefully about the compressed handwriting at the bottom of the invitation, or the warmth that moved through her chest each time she did. Some things, she had learned, were better approached directly, and without too much preliminary deliberation. She would go. She would see. She would remain, as she had always remained, entirely herself. Whatever happened after that would happen. Draven Hall was enormous in the way of things built to outlast the people inside them. Grace saw it first from the carriage window, a structure of dark stone and pale mortar set against the foothills like something that had grown there rather than been constructed, its towers catching the last of the afternoon light, in a way that turned the granite briefly amber, before the clouds moved and it went gray again. The road leading to it was flanked by old pines, their roots lifting the cobblestones in places, and the carriage rocked gently over each disruption as though apologizing for the interruption. Grace kept her hands folded in her lap and her back straight and told herself, very quietly, that she had survived harder things than a large building. She had been met at the southern road junction by 2 of Valen's guards, not the ones from the village. Different men, equally polite, and transferred to a Dravon carriage that smelled of cedar and leather and the faint sweetness of beeswax polish. The interior was plain, nothing excessive, but everything in it was of a quality that spoke of choices made by someone who understood the difference between display and substance. She had noticed that about Valen's letter too, about the way he dressed, about the coffee comment, not performed appreciation, just genuine response. He was a man, she was beginning to understand, who did not perform very much at all. Cale met her at the entrance. He had grown, she thought, or perhaps he simply looked different now that the wariness had left his posture. He stood straighter. His jaw had healed cleanly. He was wearing good clothes that actually fit him, dark wool with simple silver buttons, and he looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like someone who had been allowed to take up the appropriate amount of space. He also looked genuinely, unguardedly glad to see her, in a way that was so uncomplicated it made her throat tighten briefly. "You came," he said. "I said I would," Grace said. "People say things," Cale said, with the philosophical resignation of someone who had learned that lesson younger than he should have. "I know," Grace said. "That's why I'm careful about what I say." He carried her bag inside himself, over the mild protest of 2 attendants, and showed her to her rooms with the proprietary pride of someone personally responsible for their quality. The rooms were on the eastern side of the hall, overlooking a walled garden that was sleeping under its winter covering, but had the bone structure of something spectacular in other seasons. A fire had been laid and lit. The bed had a canopy of dark green wool. On the writing table, someone had placed a small crock of apple preserve with a card that said, In Cale's handwriting, from the Draven stores, not as good as yours, empirically proven. Grace stood in the middle of the room for a moment after Cale left, with the fire warm at her back and the gray winter garden visible through the tall window, and breathed. Then she unpacked her green dress and hung it to smooth out the journey's creases, and she washed her face and hands in the basin, and she went down to meet whatever the evening held. The gathering was smaller than she'd imagined from the word assembly. Perhaps 40 people in the main hall, PAC representatives and council members and their accompanying staff, arranged in the loose clusters of people who know each other through obligation rather than affection. The hall itself was everything the rest of the building promised. High stone arches, 2 great hearths burning at either end, long tables dressed in dark linen, candlelight warm against the gray of the walls outside. It smelled of wood smoke and roasted meat, and the particular combination of pine resin and cold stone that she realized, always now associate with this place. She found Valen before he found her, or perhaps he had already found her and was waiting for her to catch up, which seemed more consistent with what she knew of him. He was standing near the far hearth in conversation with 2 men she didn't recognize, and he was doing what she'd seen him do in her kitchen, listening with complete attention, saying very little, missing nothing. He was dressed in dark gray, simple and well cut, and he wore no insignia except a small pin at his collar that she recognized from the seal. He looked up when she was still 10 feet away. Their eyes met across the room with the particular clarity of 2 people who have, without entirely meaning to, been paying attention to each other for some time. He said something brief to the men beside him and crossed the room toward her, and Grace stood her ground and kept her hands easy at her sides and told herself firmly that her pulse was behaving entirely normally for someone in a new situation. "You look well," he said when he reached her, direct, unadorned. "The rooms are lovely," she said. "The preserve was unnecessary." That was Cale. "He had help," Grace said. Something moved in his expression. "The soup instructions were taken very seriously," he said. "There was a trial batch made last week. The kitchen staff have opinions." "The pepper at the end," Grace said. So Cale insisted, repeatedly. She almost smiled. She controlled it to something smaller. "How is he?" "Better," Valen said. And the weight in that single word, the relief compressed into it, the complicated texture of a father accounting for lost time, was so unguarded that she looked away briefly to give him the privacy of it. They stood together near the hearth for the next hour, and Grace learned that 40 people who know each other through obligation become, in the warmth of a good fire with something decent in their glasses, approximately the same as 40 people anywhere, some tedious, some sharp, some surprising, some... She spoke with a council representative from the eastern border, who turned out to have strong opinions about bread making and even stronger ones about the legal irregularities in the Southern District trade rates. She spoke with Marin, Valen's head of household staff, a compact, gray-haired woman with eyes that were doing constant quiet calculations and a handshake that was entirely confident, who told her, within the first 4 minutes, that she was glad Grace had come and that Cale had been insufferable with anticipation for the past week. "He talks about the apple preserve as though you invented the apple," Marin said. "I have a good source," Grace said. "He talks about you the same way," Marin said, with the precision of someone saying exactly what they mean. Then she moved away to attend to something before Grace could formulate a response. The formal announcements came after dinner. Valen stood at the head of the hall and spoke without ceremony. The removal of Aldrich Draven from all advisory positions, the restructuring of the Eastern Border Council, the appointment of 2 new representatives chosen by merit rather than bloodline. He spoke plainly and completely, without the performance of power, which Grace had come to understand was itself the most complete expression of it. He did not explain himself. He did not seek approval. He simply stated what was true and what was being done. And the room listened with the focused attention of people who understood that they were witnessing something that would have consequences. At the end, briefly, he spoke about the circumstances that had prompted the review: a missing boy, a wrong being done quietly over time, and the person who had seen it clearly and said so. He did not name her. He looked at her once, across the room, and then looked back at the assembly. And that was all. It was enough. Grace sat with her hands folded and her back straight, and felt something move through her that she hadn't felt in a very long time, the specific warmth of being correctly understood by someone who had the capacity to act on that understanding. It was different from being praised. It was better than being praised. It was being witnessed without being diminished. After, when the hall had thinned and the fires had settled to their lower evening burning, she found herself in the walled garden with Valen. She wasn't entirely sure how it had happened. Cale had disappeared with 2 boys of approximately his age who had arrived with one of the pack representatives, and Marin had guided Grace toward a side door with the smooth efficiency of someone who arranged things for a living. And then there had been a lit lantern on a hook and a path through the sleeping garden, and Valen was already there. The frost had come properly this evening. The air was clean and cold and still, and the garden was silver white under it, the skeletal shapes of roses and boxwood hedges made beautiful by their covering. The lantern threw warm light across the path stones. Above them, through a gap in the clouds, a scatter of stars. "Thank you for coming," Valen said. He was looking at the garden, not at her. "Thank you for the invitation," Grace said. A pause. The familiar pause, not empty, but considered. "I meant what I wrote," he said. "The choice was entirely yours." "I know," she said. "That's partly why I came." He turned to look at her then. In the lantern light, his eyes were darker than she'd seen them before, and the quality of his attention, that complete, precise focus, was directed at her with an openness she hadn't seen him offer to the room full of pack leaders and council representatives inside. "I'm not good at this," he said, saying things directly when they're personal. "I'm better at letters." "Your letters are quite good," Grace said. "Cale edits them." She looked at him. "Does he?" "He tells me when I've been too formal. He uses the word robotic." A very slight compression at the corners of his mouth. "He's not entirely wrong." Grace turned to face him properly. The cold was real and good, clearing, and she felt very awake and very present in a way she hadn't in a long time. Not braced for something difficult, but simply alert, standing in a moment that felt like it mattered. "What would you say," she asked, "if you were being less formal?" He was quiet for a moment. The frost-white garden waited. "That you walked out to meet my guards with flour on your hands," he said. "And you were afraid, and you didn't let it change what you said, and I've thought about that most days since. That I came to your village expecting to retrieve my son, and found instead someone who had already done something I hadn't managed, seen him clearly. That I read your letter 3 times before I wrote back." He paused. "That the invitation was Cale's idea, and also entirely mine. And that whatever this is, I would like to know what it is, if you're willing. Without obligation, without pressure, at whatever pace makes sense for a woman who has more than enough reason to be careful." The garden was very still. Grace looked at him for a long moment. This man who had come to her door in the gray early light and drunk her coffee, and listened without interrupting and gone home, and quietly dismantled the thing that had been grinding her down, and had not once asked her to be grateful, and had written "so do I" at the bottom of a formal invitation because he was better at letters than at saying things directly. She thought of Edmund. She thought of the cold council room and the good wool coat she'd saved for. She thought of the debt and the debt collector's smile and the 18 months of grinding economy that had also, she recognized now, been a kind of proof. Proof that she was still here, still capable, still entirely herself. She was still herself. She was certain of that. Whatever came next, she would remain that. "I'm willing," she said. "And I'm not in a hurry. But I'm not afraid of it either." Something in Valen's face settled. Not relief exactly, but the particular stillness of something that had been held tightly and could now be held differently. He nodded, once, slowly. "Then we'll figure it out," he said. "Yes," Grace said. "We will." They stood in the frost-white garden a while longer, the lantern warm between them, and talked about kale and the soup and the eastern border, and what a good spring does to a walled garden, and whether the crack in plaster is ever truly fixed or only ever postponed. Small things, real things. The kind of things that build slowly into the substance of a life. What came after was not quick or simple. Nothing real ever is. Aldrich Draven faced a formal council tribunal in the deep of winter and was stripped of his rank, his territories redistributed, his household dissolved. Kale testified. His voice was steady the entire time, and when it was over, he walked out into the snow and stood in it for a long moment before Grace, who had been waiting, put a hand briefly on his shoulder, and he nodded. And that was enough. Edmund, in the southern village, remarried the following spring. The Border Clan elder's daughter, as it turned out, which completed a circle Grace found she could look at with more weariness than bitterness. The merchant who had charged illegal rates on her debt was fined by the District Trade Council and his license reviewed. 2 other small establishments in the village saw similar corrections. None of this was dramatic. It was simply the slow, grinding work of things being made more right than they had been. The hearthside stayed open. Grace ran it for another full year, first from the village, and then, when the distance became impractical for reasons she allowed herself finally to name. She trained her neighbor's daughter fully in the running of it, and the girl proved to have a gift for the soup that Grace found genuinely, uncomplainingly excellent. The sign was repainted, dark blue, the letters clear and deep. 3 generations, and now a 4th, who had chosen it freely rather than inherited it. Grace found that even better. She moved to Draven Hall in the autumn of the following year. Not as a diminished thing, not as a woman absorbed into someone else's life, but as herself, with her copper pots and her recipe ledger, and the photograph of her mother and grandmother, and the small crock of apple preserve she made each autumn from the hearthside source, and brought north on the carriage. Because some things you carry with you, not because you need them, but because they are yours. Myron welcomed her with the efficiency and warmth that Grace had come to understand was her natural register. Kale, who was taller again and considerably less guarded, and had developed strong opinions about the council proceedings he was beginning to be included in, helped carry the copper pots to the kitchen, and told her, very seriously, that the Draven kitchen staff had been waiting for her supervision since the trial batch of turnip soup. "And," Grace said. "They've been getting the pepper wrong," he said. Valen married her on a clear day in late autumn, with the walled garden behind them, its roses in their last flowering, the old pines at the road's edge catching the light. The ceremony was small by the standards of his world. She had asked for that, and he had arranged it without question or negotiation. The council members who needed to witness it, witnessed it. Marin cried with complete composure, which Grace found entirely consistent. Kale stood beside his father and looked, for the length of the ceremony, like someone who had decided to let himself be happy about something without preparing for it to be taken away. That, Grace thought, was the real measure, not the titles, or the territories, or the formal announcements in the Great Hall. The real measure was a boy who had learned to eat slowly when he was starving, standing in a frostlit garden, letting himself be happy. She stood with Valen in the garden afterward, when the small gathering had moved inside and they were briefly alone, and she looked at him. This man who was still in all his expressions and movements and words, who had come to her door in the gray early light and drunk her coffee and listened. And she thought of all the things she had lost, and all the things she had built, and all the strange, unglamorous, necessary work of becoming someone who could stand here, in this garden, and feel only that she was in the right place. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. The garden was warm with the last of the autumn light. Somewhere inside she could hear Cale arguing with someone about Pepper. Grace leaned against her husband's shoulder and closed her eyes briefly and let the warmth be what it was. The hearthside stood in the southern village with its new sign and its new keeper and its wide hearth. The debt was gone. The bread didn't burn anymore, or not as often. The crack in the plaster was filled, and Grace, who had opened her door one rainy evening to a hungry boy with careful eyes and no coin and too much pride, and had fed him without asking anything, and had been seen, finally, completely, by someone with the capacity to see, Grace was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because fate had arranged it, because she had chosen it, step by careful step, with flour on her hands and her back straight, and her voice steady even when she was afraid. That was all. That was everything. That was enough.